welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Economists, like all professors, face the great challenge every day of trying to interest our students in learning about our subjects. How can we get students to want to learn about supply, demand, and gross domestic product? Many economists like to use references to pop culture to engage our students. Joining me to talk about his efforts using Comedy Central's animated show South Park is my colleague from the Johnson Center, Dr. George Crowley. George, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I think we'll see in a few minutes that there's actually quite a few economic lessons from South Park. But just to begin with, you're not the only person who's used tools from popular culture to try to illustrate economics. What are some of the other types of TV shows or movies that people have been looking at as a way to motivate economics?
Yeah, so this is something, like you mentioned in your intro, that economists and college professors in general face as an issue, is trying to get students excited about the ideas. Personally, I use the television show South Park in my classes, but other professors have used shows such as Seinfeld or even The Simpsons. So we have a mutual friend who recently had a book that came out about using The Simpsons to teach economics. All sorts of other types of medium, like movies and music, all trying to get these ideas across in kind of a fun way.
Now, some of our viewers might have a reaction to this idea of using TV shows or movies in a class as somehow like that can't be a very good idea, that you must be wasting time, or wouldn't it, is it just a sign of laziness on the part of a professor, or you're all familiar with like a high school teacher who just wants to show movies and sit in their class instead of actually teaching the class? And so at one level, viewers might be saying, well, why don't you go ahead and try to teach the material? I mean, an English professor shouldn't be just showing people movies about Shakespeare. You need to read Shakespeare as well. So what do you and other people, why do you think using pop culture is a good tool?
Yeah, so I mean, I would completely agree with the people that says the individuals teaching an English class should be having their students read Shakespeare in addition to perhaps showing a movie. The important thing to keep in mind here is that you use pop culture references, be it a television show, a movie, anything else, as a way to kind of hook students, and then you get to the content. Economists in particular, we have a reputation of being very dry. We have here Ben Stein from the classic Ferris Bueller movie, and just has economists in general, we have this kind of preconception working against us that economics is a dry subject and it's usually taught by people that aren't terribly interesting. So anything you can do to essentially get students hooked on the concepts, be it through some kind of humorous television show like I use or other medium, and then you, of course, have the real conversation. No one would argue that it's a good idea to just show episodes of South Park and think it's a substitute for an economics lesson. But if you can use pop culture to get students interested in the ideas and then bring it around and bring it down to the actual lecture content, I think that's very useful.
So it's all about trying to get students to get outside their boxes and think about something. And do you find this to be successful in class? Yeah,
absolutely. So I've been using it. I've been using South Park and other types of medium in my classes for years now, and I do find it to be very successful. It gets students fired up. It gets them interested. You're showing something that they would not necessarily expect. They go into a class, they expect to see Ben Stein with a chalkboard. You show them something that gets them fired up, gets them interested. It's not something they're typically used to seeing in a classroom setting. And then you have the conversation. Well, look, that was an absurd, over-the-top example from a cartoon, but let's talk about how this actually is taking place in the real world as well.
And you've recently done some research to write up the results of what you've been your use of South Park in the classroom. So what are some of the advantages of South Park compared to some of the other TV shows or movies that other people have been using?
So one of the main features of South Park, and it's something that we should probably probably mention to the audience, is that South Park it's kind of an adult-oriented cartoon. I mean, it's got a lot of kind of vulgar language in it, a lot of a raunch factor to it, if you will, and it's designed to be shocking and get the conversation started. I think that's actually a feature of South Park that makes it very useful in a classroom setting at the college level anyway. Because it has that kind of edge to it, it has that kind of current nature to it. A lot of these episodes of South Park are finished literally only hours or days before they actually air. They're always relevant, they're always right up to the right up to the minute, as it were. And they're designed specifically to parody and satirize current events. So I think the kind of combo of the idea that we have, this edginess to it that kind of gets students interested, especially college-age students, as well as just the current event nature of it, makes it really useful.
Now, in addition to the economics that you mentioned, that there is certainly an anti-authoritarian bent to things, a strong libertarian bent to some of the themes and episodes in South Park. Plus also the economics and public choice that we'll get into in a few moments. But do you have any idea, like, where do the creators, where are they getting this stuff from? Is there anything about their background that gives us a clue as to why they have so many references to economics, or why there's so much good economics in this show? Yeah,
so it's something that a lot of people have asked, and actually one of the co-creators of the show, Matt Stone, his father was an economics professor and actually authored an economics textbook. So it's perhaps unsurprising that you would get the good economics in the show. They actually cite him as one of the major contributors to our particular episode from a few years ago that dealt with some of the nuances of the financial crisis. As far as the more libertarian bend on it, whenever they've been asked about this and interviewed, they tend to just express a dissatisfaction with essentially the mainstream left, right, or Democrat Republican divide. I don't know that they actually identify as libertarian, but I think that they are very dissatisfied, as a lot of libertarians would kind of fall into that same camp, dissatisfied with the status quo of kind of the two-party system.
Well, we're going to turn to an episode that illustrates a number of the important principles of public choice. But before we get to that, could you just tell our viewers what exactly we mean? You and I are both public choice economists by training, but what exactly is public choice economics?
So public choice in a nutshell is basically taking the tools of economics, the basic tools of economics, the ideas, things like the fact that incentives matter, and boiling it down and turning that lens on government action. So instead of taking, as economics had done prior to public choice's advent and other disciplines do, taking the government as some entity, public choice economists actually break it down into the individuals acting within the government and taking a look at the incentives each one of them face, and then moving from there to see possible explanations for the types of outcomes we see from public sector action.
So let's turn to the first of the episodes that we'll be talking about here today. And this is an episode from 2004 where there ends up being an election at the local elementary school in South Park. So tell us a little bit about this episode.
So the premise of this episode in particular is the school mascot needs to be replaced. And as you might expect elementary school students to do, when they're asked to make suggestions for a possible replacement school mascot, they make some pretty absurd and fairly controversial, inappropriate type suggestions. But it being South Park and it trying to push the envelope and be a satire, these are actually the choices that are presented to the students to vote on, and neither one of them is particularly compelling. Stan, one of the main characters, actually decides to abstain from voting altogether, and is chastised to the point that he's actually exiled from town. There's a reference to the then popular in 2004 Vote or Die campaign that some music artists were campaigning about. And basically the whole premise of the show, of this particular episode, focuses on Stan's decision to not vote and the reaction he gets from his family, his fellow students, ultimately culminating in, him being banished from the town.
And so that deals first with the very important point from public choice about the, depending on how you want to think of it, the low value of voting. So to talk a little bit about why this is that from an instrumental standpoint, from the standpoint of trying to affect elections, that our votes don't really matter.
Right. So this is a controversial point that public choice. Well, it's not controversial amongst public choice economists, but when non-public choice economists talk about it, or certainly political scientists talk about it, it's controversial. And it's the idea that from an economic standpoint, from the expected value, if you will, of your vote, there's actually very little chance your vote will, any individual vote will actually affect an election. That's the important thing to keep in mind here. It's not making the argument that votes don't count. It's that the actual chance your individual vote is going to sway an election, in other words, have a meaningful impact on policy or a candidate that's chosen, is essentially zero. And a lot of people take this to mean public choice economists are saying, oh, don't vote, or it's silly to vote. And that's not what the point is at all. The point is much more that because individuals are aware of the fact that their individual vote is relatively meaningless, they're not going to take the time to get informed about voting, or they might go and vote fairly randomly, or we see commonly people vote straight ticket for one party or the other. And this is what public choice is basically getting at. The fact that since each individual vote is relatively meaningless, individuals are not going to take the time to get informed when making choices. And
as you have already alluded to, I mean, this ends up having a lot of important implications for how voting interacts or ends up affecting the whole system. I mean, one of the things that sometimes I think we can understand once you recognize the low value to the individual voting, and why we would have want to try to make people think that it's their duty to vote. And maybe why we even have civics classes in high school to try to inculcate this into people when they're young, to make them think, oh, it's really important to vote, and thus some of the extent to which they're lampooning this in this episode of South Park. But even if we do have that, because overall elections end up being valuable to society, I mean, as you mentioned, what you have to really do is break down and take a look at how does this affect the individual incentives, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like they do in this episode of South Park, the point is being made that voting in and of itself is this civic duty or a very important act. And I'm certainly not making the point that it's not important. I'm saying that even if that is the primary driving factor for why people are going to go vote, because they want to be involved in the process, we would still not necessarily expect them to be taking the time needed to be fully informed on voting. So we need to make sure we take a careful look at this as economists, at what we would actually realistically expect to come out of elections, the electoral process, if it's essentially taking preferences across people that are not necessarily taking the time to get informed and aggregating them up. It might not necessarily be the outcomes that we would find desirable.
Right. And then another thing that might happen is that people could vote to try to make a point. There was I think called expressive voting. Like
sure.
You're trying to signal something, how concerned you might be for the environment or concerned for the average person in casting a vote on something. Mm-hmm. And therefore, I guess preferences aren't being aggregated in sort of the same way we observe with markets, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's actually some really interesting theoretical literature on this. Gordon Tullock has written on this idea that people vote along these expressive lines, the idea of trying to signal that, oh, well, I'm pro the environment, or I'm pro American workers, or they're voting along these things just to kind of prove a point. And the issue is that if you get enough of these just purely expressive votes, then you actually start swaying policy in directions that, again, may not necessarily be as desirable.
Another of the principles of public choice, I think, it get illustrated in this episode of South Park, has to do with the effect. What I like to think of it as the selection effects of our electoral and political process. That there are a lot of rigors to campaigning. A lot of it has to be involved in being often a long-term member of a party before you can run for office and so forth. And so, talk a little bit about how that comes up in this episode and what these selection effects mean for like our democracy.
Right. So this is it certainly takes place in this episode. We have candidates that are basically just picked because they are so absurd by the boys. But they get this momentum across everybody in the town, start pointing out as the lesser of two evils and things along this line. And it ultimately culminates in a discussion of, where Stan is having a conversation about why he's choosing not to vote. He doesn't see the point across these two candidates. And he's reminded that this is usually the way elections turn out. You usually are left with undesirable alternatives. I'm sure everybody watching has heard people talk about, well, I don't necessarily like this candidate, but I'm going to vote for him because he's better than the other guy. I'm voting for the lesser of two evils. Hayek has actually written on this, the famous economist, talking about the worst getting on top. And it's basically this argument that politicians have a comparative advantage, like individuals have comparative advantage. Their comparative advantage is in being politicians, that they know how to play the game, as it were. So they have the type of institutional capital, like you said, as far as people being invested for a long period of time, have the connections, they have that skill set. So we actually would expect to see a certain type of individual be able to rise to the top of power in a political party. And unfortunately, this isn't necessarily the type of individual a lot of people sympathize with or would choose to vote for.
Yeah, certainly concerns about whether we have any great statesmen or stateswomen rising to positions of authority in a modern democracy. It's a third issue that I think a principle that it gets illustrated here. There are some efforts in this episode of South Park to, in fact, buy votes, to bribe some of the other students with candy. And that highlights, as economists, when we talk about exchange, we view exchange very favorably, but when we take it and apply it over into the electoral realm with vote buying, it gets viewed very differently. What's the difference here?
Yeah, so the idea that you could buy votes, if my individual vote is relatively meaningless, I'm essentially going to either vote randomly or choose not to vote. Shouldn't somebody that actually does care or has more information be allowed to come buy my vote? It's an interesting idea, and it's something that you do sometimes hear get kicked around amongst economists. The important thing that I think to take away from this is that we need to actually make sure we're clear on what outcomes we want, because the incentive structures we set up is going to necessarily lead to those outcomes. So a system where we had a market for votes would likely, like all markets, actually end up with those resources, in this case the votes, moving towards the most highest valued use, or the use that we're actually able to pay the most. It's unclear that that's necessarily in and of itself a good thing like it is in a market, because we're talking about, in government, the power to basically tax and spend. So we would perhaps be losing out on some of the equity concerns people are necessarily interested in when it comes to their government. You see this with similar kind of suggestions for ways to reform the voting system, be it requiring voting like they do in some countries, or making people pass an intelligence test. There's no silver bullet kind of way to fix the electoral system. I think it's very important that we always focus on the types of incentives we're going to create and making sure they align with outcomes we actually find favorable.
Well, so they have an episode covering the basics of public choice. They also have several episodes which illustrate a number of issues regarding the markets, and actually in a rather sophisticated fashion. There's an episode from 1998 that has actually gotten quite a bit of attention amongst economists as a statement of illustration of the market. And this is an episode called Gnomes. So tell us a little bit about this episode.
So the episode that you're referring to, Gnomes, is again, it's a season 2 episode. It's a very early episode. There's principally 2 main storylines going on in the episode, and the one that these images refer to is essentially a local coffee shop owner having to face the challenge of a large chain. They call it Starbucks. It's clearly a Starbucks kind of ripoff, coming to town and threatening his livelihood. That we have it's the familiar story that a large corporation comes to town and it puts out the mom and pop businesses. What this episode actually does, and it does a very good job of, is while it at least from the face would appear to be kind of poking fun at the familiar story of the large evil corporation, one of the things that they actually show in this episode is the small business owner trying to basically convince government, the local government, to pass rules and regulations that would prohibit entry from these new firms. And it's this idea, again, kind of getting at the idea that a new company comes to town and it's a threat to local businesses. Well, the local businesses actually can play just as dirty as the evil corporations, and that they go through the state to try to prevent entry and competition.
And again, the episode also deals with how it is that the large Starbucks coffee chain got to be so large, and the question of whether such large businesses were using some kind of unfair advantage to drive out the small, more virtuous and better mom and pop stores or not.
Right. So it's basically getting at this idea that we have how in a truly free market, how large companies actually become successful, and it's generally done through providing goods and services to individuals value, and doing it at a lower cost or a better quality than their competitors. Those are the ones that become the most successful. So I think we have another slide here where the secondary storyline that's going on in this episode deals with the actual gnomes from the title, and they're the underpants gnomes. It's clearly just kind of a silly example, but it's basically, it deals with these little gnomes that are basically going around and collecting people's underpants in the episode, and they have absolutely no plan as far as how they're going to turn it into profit, but they know they're going to make profit. And this is the part of the episode that a lot of economists kind of hung up on, and it's this idea that most individuals don't actually understand the entrepreneurial process. That's what makes large, successful companies so successful and why they end up earning such high profits, because they actually understand what phase 2 is. Most people point and we see the profit and we get upset about that. It's like, oh, well, they must be exploiting individuals or something along these lines. But really, it's the entrepreneurial processes and this idea that you actually do understand how to take some inputs, do something with them people have never thought of doing before, and provide a good and service people actually value. And that's how you earn a profit in a real free economy.
This episode also illustrates a term that economists like to use called creative destruction. Right? So tell us a little bit about what creative destruction is.
So creative destruction is actually one of these great terms that that means pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's the idea that the creative process itself can actually be destructive to essentially the old way of doing it. So the easiest way to think about it is whenever we have a new invention come along. So the automobile comes along, and no one in their right mind would think that was a bad idea, that we shouldn't have had an automobile. It revolutionized the way we essentially did everything. But if you were involved in the horse and buggy industry, it completely destroyed your livelihood. Within a short period of time, that entire industry, which was once a booming, important, dominant industry, is completely destroyed. We've essentially gone out with the old, in with the new, and replaced old innovations, old ways of doing things, old products even, with new innovations, new technologies, new companies. And this process is certainly painful for those that find themselves being essentially shifted out of the market, but it's absolutely essential for economic growth. It frees those resources and allows us to continue to innovate.
And in some ways, it shows one of the enduring clashes in an economy between the old ways of doing things and the new ways of doing things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important we go through this. We go through this at any given point where we see new firms going and asking to be kind of bailed out or protected against the next best thing. And it's always a very sympathetic story now, because we can see the people that are going to lose their jobs. Right. But what I would always ask people to do is to look back through time and see, what if we had protected horses and buggies? What if we had protected any of these old ways of doing things that were essentially replaced by new ways that totally revolutionized our economy?
Right. I mean, at one point in time, we had lots of operators that operated the phone system simply by plugging the actual connecting the calls that way. And, you might have thought at the time, if we adopted new technology to automate that process, what would all these people do?
Right. And again, it's not to trivialize the idea. It's not to trivialize that this isn't an extremely painful process for people that have done something their whole life and then basically find themselves out of a job. But it's very important to realize that the economy will stagnate if we do not allow this process to happen. Every time we protect jobs or protect new entry or new type of innovation, we're actually holding back or attempting to hold back and constrain the growth of the economy. So we actually need these resources freed up. And again, this is economic jargon for saying people losing their jobs. That's painful, but it's absolutely essential for continued economic growth.
I think that some of the references here to creative destruction in like the large chain companies were particularly end up being doubly illustrative, because there's the movie You've Got Mail from 1998 also that was railing about the large corporate booksellers coming in, of course, off the model of Borders. And so yes, Borders was displacing all of the smaller bookstores that were in existence then, but Borders is now out of business itself, having a product of creative destruction on both sides.
Right.
There's one other episode we want to talk a little about today, and that's an episode also that goes back to 2004. And it's an episode in which, oops, we're going the wrong way here. Let's go forward. And this is an episode to talk about Walmart coming to, or something close to a takeoff on Walmart coming to South Park. Tell us a little bit about this episode.
Yeah, so this of course deals with perhaps the prototypical example of a large company coming to town and the alleged ill effects that these large companies have on small businesses. So we have an episode here where a Walmart comes to town, and the result in this satire is it has this exact effect that you would actually hear people talk about in the popular media and elsewhere, of destroying the small town. Everybody immediately flocks to Walmart. Everybody gets employed by Walmart. We have massive amounts of consumerism where people find themselves buried in just random and unnecessary purchases. And Walmart has this kind of disastrous effect on the South Park economy. It's a very interesting episode because it gets at basically this thing that economists talk about, this idea that a firm that comes to town is actually that successful is clearly doing something consumers value. No one's forcing people to go shop at a Walmart, or certainly no one's forcing them to get employed at a Walmart. And to the extent that they are displacing businesses, they're doing so because they're providing a good service at either a lower cost or a higher quality, and consumers are made better off by that.
Yeah, and that's where a lot of our progress is actually coming from. And the episode also sort of pokes at this whole idea of consumerism and consumer values as somehow being imposed upon us almost, by some third force or large corporations forcing us to be these consumers, and yet that's not where it's actually coming from, right? Yeah,
I mean, it's all about voluntary trade. If individuals like to go shop at a store like a Walmart, or like to go eat in chain restaurants, or any of these other corporate entities that come in, or get their coffee at Starbucks, that come in and are these threats to small businesses, as long as it's a voluntary transaction and no one's being forced to do that, people are made better off. Both parties benefit. There's nothing that stops people from continuing to shop at local stores, eat local restaurants. Most people, when they travel, if they're in a new town, they're not going to go to the proverbial chain restaurant. They'll try to go find the local hole in the wall or something like this. And even if it means paying a higher price or having to deal with some sort of inefficiency that you wouldn't necessarily get at a chain restaurant, people are willing to do that if the quality of the product is good enough. And that's what it's really all about. Any small business that tries to compete directly with Walmart is going to lose. There's no doubt about it. But small businesses remain successful by differentiating themselves, either having even if it's at a higher price, they have a more hands-on, consumer-friendly kind of approach. It's not the sterile, you walk into a Walmart and being overwhelmed by choices. If they're able to offer that type of service and compete on different margins, there's no reason they can't continue to be successful.
And even the large companies like Walmart, they face competition. I mean, if we went back a few years before Walmart became so popular, I mean, you might have thought that Kmart was going to be the Walmart of the future. And so Walmart only got to where it was simply because it outcompeted companies like Kmart that were doing it in essentially the same thing.
Absolutely, and you would probably be able to point to the kind of rise of online shopping, specifically through places like Amazon, where you can get stuff shipped to you for free in 2 days, as perhaps the next thing that's going to be a serious threat to a Walmart. It wouldn't surprise me at all if we fast forward a decade or so and look back, and Walmart is not necessarily the dominant force it is today. And we'll probably be having the same conversation that we're having about Kmart now, about how silly it was to think that this was going to basically monopolize everything.
Or if they're going to still continue to be dominant, they'll have to have evolved and changed and engaged in their own further creation.
Absolutely.
Well, it's just to wrap up. Many times we as economists like to point out that economics are sort of like everywhere in our lives. So I guess it's not a big surprise that we can turn to popular culture and see a lot of economic examples, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's kind of the main point here, and it's essentially what drew me to using a show like South Park in the classroom, and the paper you referenced, that is a bigger project. This idea of looking at taking economics, which is truly a discipline that you can apply to everything, and finding it in the most random or shocking or perhaps just entertaining places. And the important thing that I think that we need to make sure we're clear on here is that you can point to episodes of South Park and point to the absurdity of things in South Park, and your students will see that and be able to catch on to the message very quickly. The important point is then to take that understanding of the kind of absurd extreme case and apply it to the real world.
Well, thank you very much, George. We've come to the end of our time. And thank you. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.